Welcome back to our podcast. This is your friend, Dr. James. Today, we are continuing our deep dive into historical theology, specifically looking at how the earliest Christians understood the human person, the nature of sin, and our ability to choose. Now, before we jump in, I want to be very clear about our source today. We are drawing extensively from the research and lectures of Dr. Ken Wilson, specifically his work on sin in early church fathers. Much of what you hear today, the quotes, the analysis, and specifically the illustrations we'll use, comes directly from Dr. Wilson's scholarship, including his thesis work at Oxford. We want to give full credit where it is due for this incredible collection of historical data. In our last episode, we covered the earliest years up to 180 AD. Today, we are moving the timeline forward. We're looking at that crucial window from 180 AD all the way up to 400 AD, stopping just before we get to Augustine. So let's set the stage. We are looking at some of the heavy hitters of theology here. We start with Irenaeus. Now, Irenaeus is often called the first theologian to really systematize the faith, to say, this is exactly what we believe and why. Alongside him, you have Tertullian, a massive figure in Latin theology. Both of these men held a high view of God's sovereignty, but, and this is key, they taught that free will was based on foreknowledge. This was what they called the regula fidei, or the rule of faith, the teaching handed down from the apostles themselves. Let's look at what Irenaeus actually wrote in his famous work Against Heresies. He talks about salvation and says, since it was the Lord himself who saved them, because they could not be saved by their own instrumentality, showing that the good thing of salvation is not from us, but from God. That sounds like pure grace, right? And it is. But listen to how he connects that to human will. Irenaeus continues. All such passages demonstrate the independent will of man. God exhorts us to submit ourselves to him and seeks to turn us away from the sin of unbelief, without, however, in any way coercing us. He's saying God invites, God exhorts, but God does not coerce. Irenaeus doubles down on this. He says, and not merely in works, but also in faith, has God preserved the will of man free and under his own control, saying, according to thy faith, be it unto thee. Thus showing that there is a faith specially belonging to man, since he has an opinion specially his own. That is a fascinating phrase. A faith specially belonging to man. Irenaeus argues that if God just forced belief, passages like all things are possible to him that believes wouldn't make sense. He argues that God, foreknowing all things, leaves people to the darkness they have chosen for themselves. Then we have Tertullian. He was fighting against the heresy of Marcion, and he had to address why evil exists if God is good. Tertullian says you cannot blame evil on God, it comes from human free choice. Listen to this. Since he has once for all allowed to man freedom of will and mastery of himself, surely he, from his very authority and creation, permitted these gifts to be enjoyed. So, the early consensus is forming. God permits free will, and he does not interfere to stop what he does not wish to happen, specifically so that the freedom he gave us remains intact. Let's move geographically now. We're going to Alexandria, Egypt, around 200 AD to visit Clement of Alexandria. Clement tackles the issue of original sin, or rather, how the early church didn't view it the way many do today. He asks a rhetorical question about a newborn baby. Let them tell us where the newly born child committed fornication, or how a thing that has performed no action at all has fallen under the curse of Adam. He's arguing that a baby hasn't performed an action, so they aren't under the guilt of a curse. Even when referencing Psalm 51, in sin did my mother conceive me, Clement says David isn't saying he is sin, but rather alluding to Eve. This is backed up by scholars like Dewey Wallace, who notes in the Encyclopedia of Religion that the chief concern of these fathers, Clement, Origen, and others, was to combat fatalism. Remember, the pagan religions and the Gnostics of the time believed in fate. They believed everything was predetermined by the stars or the gods. The Christians were the ones saying, "No, you are free to sow righteousness." They were fighting for the concept that humans have a choice. Let's jump to the mid-3rd century. We have Cyprian, around 250 AD, saying plainly in his testimonies against the Jews, "The liberty of believing or of not believing is placed in free choice." And then we have Ambrose of Milan. Now, this is a crucial connection because Ambrose is the man who actually baptized Augustine of Hippo. But listen to Ambrose's theology, which differs from where Augustine eventually went. Ambrose uses the foot washing of Peter as an analogy. He says, Peter was clean, but he needed to wash his feet, for he still had sin by derivation from the first man. His foot is washed that hereditary sins may be removed, for his own sins are remitted by baptism. Did you catch that distinction? Ambrose is saying that in baptism, we deal with our personal sins, but the foot washing is for the hereditary sin, the stuff we got from Adam. He distinguishes between what we inherited and what we actually do. We see this same thought in John Chrysostom around 400 AD. In his sermons on Romans, he asks, "How would it follow from disobedience another would become a sinner? For at this rate a man will not even deserve punishment if, that is, it was not from his own self that he became a sinner." Chrysostom is adamant, you cannot be punished for something you didn't do yourself. He says God's assistance is great, but he does not anticipate our choice, lest our free will should be outraged. It's a partnership. We choose, and then he leads. Now, Dr. Wilson points out that when we read these fathers, whether it's the Latin speakers in the West like Lactantius and Hilary, or the Greek speakers in the East like Basil and the Gregories, they are speaking a different language than the later Augustinian tradition. Take Methodius, for example. He gives a great logical argument. He says if man were made like a rock or a tree, something that just follows nature, he wouldn't deserve a reward. He would be like an instrument of the maker, and it would be unreasonable for him to suffer blame for his wrongdoings, for the real author of them is the one by whom he is used. Methodius is saying if you don't have free will, you aren't an agent, you're a tool, and you don't blame the hammer for hitting the thumb, you blame the carpenter. The early fathers refused to make God the author of sin. This brings us to a very important theological distinction regarding the fall. Gregory of Nyssa is actually the first to use the term original sin. But, and this is a massive but, what he meant by it was a weakness of the moral will, not inherited guilt. The consensus was this: Adam's fall brought physical death to everyone. It brought a moral weakness, a propensity to sin. But it did not bring spiritual death in the sense of total inability. Gregory explicitly stated that newly born children are exempt from sin. Cyril of Jerusalem backs this up. He says physical death cannot be a penalty for sin because infants die and they have no personal sin. So, if death isn't a penalty, what is it? Here is a powerful illustration provided by Dr. Ken Wilson to explain this distinction. Imagine a father with young children. This father commits a crime and is sent to prison. Now, because he is in prison, his children are left alone. There is no mother, no financial support. The children end up starving, and tragically, they might even die. Now ask yourself, was the death of those children the penalty for their father's sin? No, the father is paying the penalty in prison. The children are suffering the consequences of his sin. Dr. Wilson points out that there is a massive gap between being penalized for someone else's sin, guilt, and suffering the consequences of it. The early fathers, like Cyril, argued that we all suffer the consequences of Adam's sin, death, corruption, weakness, but we are not guilty of it until we choose to sin ourselves. So, as we wrap up this survey from 180 to 400 AD, we have to look at the data. Dr. Wilson's research at Oxford reviewed the extant writings of these fathers. He lists 47 of them who address this specific topic. And what is the score? 47 out of 47. Over 300 years, across all continents, in multiple languages, the rule of faith was unbroken. They all agreed. 1. Fatalism is a pagan philosophy. 2. Adam's fall corrupted nature but did not destroy the human capacity to respond to God. 3. We retain a residual ability to say yes when God invites us. They thought that if we were unable to do anything but sin, we could not be judged guilty. This was the universal Christian view for the first 4 centuries. So, if everyone agreed for 400 years, what happened? Well, that is where our story takes a turn. Next time, we are going to look at the figure who changed the conversation, Augustine of Hippo. Thanks for listening. Again, a huge acknowledgement to Dr. Ken Wilson for his scholarship on this topic. We'll see you in the next episode.